In June 2004, Japan was shocked by a shocking crime that occurred within the walls of a school in Sasebo, Nagasaki Prefecture. It was a normal school day at Okubo High School. The students went about their business at recess, preparing for lessons and discussing the latest news, as it happens among teenagers. However, this day turned out to be fatal and forever changed the lives of many people. There was a normal atmosphere in the classroom until the moment when the doors suddenly opened and Natsumi Tsuji entered the office. The 11-year-old girl had an impenetrable mask of calm on her face, which immediately attracted the attention of her classmates. Their gazes slowly sank down and terror ran through the ranks of the students. Natsumi's clothes were stained with blood, her hands were shaking, but she moved confidently and calmly. At that moment it became clear that something terrible had happened. Natsumi Tsuji, despite her young age, was already known as a girl with high intelligence and unusual interests, but no one could have imagined that these interests would lead to a brutal murder right at school. That day, Natsumi attacked her classmate, 12-year-old Satomi Metarai, in one of the empty rooms of the school and killed her with extreme cruelty. After that, Natsumi returned to the classroom as if nothing had happened, leaving a trail of blood and horror behind her. This crime, known as Sasebo slashing, has rocked not only Japan but the whole world. People were asking questions: how could this happen? What prompted a young girl to commit such a cruel act? And most importantly, could this tragedy have been prevented? Natsumi Tsuji was born in 1992 in the quiet seaside town of Sasebo, which is located in Nagasaki Prefecture in western Japan. This city is famous for its picturesque landscapes, favorable atmosphere and tranquility, which have become the background for the girl's life since her birth. Natsumi's family was well off enough. Her parents took care of her education and did everything possible to provide their daughter with a better future. Since early childhood, Natsumi has shown signs of extraordinary intelligence. Educators and teachers noted her unusually high level of mental development, curiosity, and the ability to assimilate information much faster than her peers. She easily coped with the curriculum, often demonstrating deep knowledge in literature and mathematics. However, along with these positive traits, Natsumi gradually began to show more disturbing features. Already in elementary school, she developed a strange hobby and interest in dark and gloomy topics. At first, this was reflected in her choice of books and films. She preferred mystical stories, often with elements of horror and violence. But soon this interest grew into something more. Natsumi was fascinated by the topic of death and dismemberment, watching images and videos that most children her age couldn't even stand. Her passion for these materials was not just a child's curiosity, she had a genuine attraction to the study of anatomy and violence. Friends and classmates recalled that she sometimes talked about her findings with great enthusiasm, discussing details that shocked and frightened her peers. Natsumi's parents, busy with their own affairs, did not immediately pay attention to these warning signs. They considered her interests to be something temporary that would pass over time. However, teachers and school psychologists were already beginning to worry. At Okubo School, where Natsumi studied, teachers noticed her isolation from her peers. She rarely interacted with other children, often preferring to spend time alone, immersed in her thoughts or reading books. The literature teacher, Ms. Sato, recalled how Natsumi once enthusiastically talked about a book that described a brutal murder. She talked about it with such interest and even admiration, Sato later told the interrogation. I felt uneasy when I realized how deeply she was fascinated by the topic of violence. However, despite these alarming signals, no one at school could have imagined that her interests would grow into something more. Over time, Natsumi's social isolation only intensified. Her peers began to avoid her, feeling her strangeness and even danger. The children often said that she could suddenly get angry for no apparent reason, and her harsh words and unpredictable behavior scared them. She seemed to take pleasure in provoking others into conflict, and at times her actions looked intentionally cruel. One of her classmates, Kenji Maeda, recalled how Natsumi once pushed him down the school stairs. She looked down at me, and there was something in her eyes that I had never seen in other people, he said during one of the interrogations. It was like she was enjoying my fear. Despite such incidents, many of those around them still viewed Natsumi's behavior as a kind of teenage reaction to stress or inner feelings. Nevertheless, it was precisely these manifestations of isolation and aggression that became the first alarming signals that serious changes were taking place in her psyche. Over time, Natsumi's interests became more specific and gloomy. She began collecting information about serial killers and their methods, and also showed an unhealthy curiosity about bodily injuries and anatomy. Her notes and drawings found later showed that she often fantasized about violence, creating detailed diagrams and diagrams. Teachers and school psychologists began to discuss Natsumi's behavior at meetings more and more often, but no concrete action was taken. The topic of mental disorders is rarely raised in Japanese culture, and many teachers believed that they had no right to interfere in a child's personal life. Natsumi's parents, like most Japanese families, tried not to take the trash out of the house and hoped that their daughter's behavior would change on its own. Perhaps these symptoms indicated the development of a disorder that was not diagnosed in time. Constant thoughts of death, dismemberment, and violence can be signs of serious mental disorders such as psychopathy or antisocial personality disorder. However, no one made any attempts to refer Natsumi to a specialist for a detailed examination and psychiatric care. This protracted process of ignoring the alarming symptoms led to the fact that on one of the usual school days, Natsumi Tsuji decided to turn her dark fantasies into reality, which eventually led to a tragedy that could have been avoided. June 1, 2004 began as a normal day at Okubo School in Sasebo City. The students came to class discussing the upcoming summer holidays and looking forward to a long-awaited break from studying. The school was in its usual rhythm change calls, children's laughter in the corridors, familiar teachers at the departments. No one could have imagined that this day would forever change the life of one class and the entire school community. Natsumi Tsuji, like all her classmates, came to school in the morning and seemed no different from the rest. However, those who were attentive enough might have noticed something unusual in her behavior that day. Usually withdrawn and preferring solitude, Natsumi looked collected today, but a little worried. Her eyes shone with a strange light, as if she was on the verge of committing an important act. According to the memoirs of her friend Hanako, Natsumi was in high spirits and even tried to start a conversation. She asked me if I believed in an afterlife and what I would do if I could kill someone and get away with it, Hanako later recalled. At that moment, it seemed to her that Natsumi was just joking or experiencing another surge of interest in dark topics. But, as it turned out later, this conversation was a harbinger of what was to come. Satomi Mitarai was one of the best students in the class. She was distinguished by a calm disposition and benevolence, always ready to help classmates. Satomi was a little older than Natsumi, but that didn't stop them from communicating. They even spent time together sometimes, discussing school matters and common interests. However, their relationship has become strained in recent weeks. The reason for this was the rumors and gossip that went around the class. Some time ago, Satomi left a comment on Natsumi's blog, which the latter took as a mockery or insult. It later turned out that this comment was the starting point for the growing hostility. Natsumi seems to be fixated on this incident, feeling humiliated and unfairly wronged. This incident was minor, but against the background of Natsumi's mental state, it became a catalyst for more serious intentions. Her obsession with violence combined with internal conflicts and feelings of resentment led her to choose Satomi as her victim. Natsumi prepared her crime with amazing coolness and calculation. She decided to act during the lunch break, when many students go out to the dining room or stay in the classroom doing their own business. At this point, the school was less busy, and Natsumi could implement her plan without attracting too much attention. She had a knife, small but sharp, which she had brought from home. According to her, she chose the knife for several reasons. It is easy to hide, and it could cause fatal wounds without requiring significant effort. Her actions were thought out to the smallest detail, as if she had rehearsed this moment over and over again. Natsumi approached Satomi during lunch and invited her into an empty classroom under the pretext of discussing those misunderstandings on the blog. Satomi, unaware of Natsumi's intentions, followed her. They entered a room where there was no one but them. The door closed softly behind them. Satomi sat down at her desk, waiting for Natsumi to start a conversation. But Natsumi didn't say a word. She took a knife out of her pocket and attacked her classmate without warning. Satomi didn't have time to figure out what was going on. The first blow was fast and accurate, hitting the neck. Satomi screamed in pain and surprise, but did not have time to realize the seriousness of the situation. Natsumi continued to strike, her movements fast and desperate. Each strike was aimed at taking Satomi's life as soon as possible. Her face was contorted in a grimace of rage and, perhaps, a strange satisfaction. She didn't stop until Satomi stopped struggling and sank to the floor, covered in blood. After it was over, Natsumi showed no signs of remorse or fear. Her hands and clothes were covered in blood, but she didn't seem to pay attention to it. She just left the room and headed back to class as if nothing had happened. When she entered the classroom, the students and the teacher froze in shock. Natsumi calmly walked to her seat and sat down without saying a word. "What happened to you?" "You're covered in blood," one of her classmates exclaimed. To which Natsumi, looking straight ahead, quietly replied, "I just killed Satomi." Her words had the effect of an exploding bomb. The teacher immediately called the school administration and the police. Natsumi sat quietly, with a faraway look, while panic began around her. Soon, the school was cordoned off by the police, and the first interrogations began. When Natsumi Tsuji entered the classroom, everyone present froze in horror. The first moments passed in a daze. No one understood what was happening. Natsumi's face was calm, but her school uniform and hands were covered in blood. There was a deathly silence in the classroom, and only one of the students, pointing in horror at her clothes, asked what happened. "Why are you covered in blood?" Natsumi, without changing her expression and with an impenetrable look, uttered the words that shocked everyone. "I just killed Satomi." These words seemed impossible to comprehend at first. The students and the teacher slowly began to realize that something terrible had happened. The shock grew, and excitement gripped the class. The teacher, Ms. Tanaka, was the first to come to her senses. She immediately realized that the situation was extremely serious and tried to remain calm. "Natsumi, what are you saying? What happened?" "What is it?" she asked, trying not to show her fear. But Natsumi's response was as cold and frightening as before. "She was laughing at me. She's dead now." Realizing that the matter was taking a serious turn, Ms. Tanaka immediately led all the students out of the classroom and ordered the door to be closed. She then ran to the principal's office to report the incident. The principal, Mr. Nakamura, immediately took action. He called the police, called an ambulance, and sent an emergency alert to the school. While the school administration was trying to figure out the situation, the students who were taken out of the classroom began to panic. Many of them were crying, others could not believe what was happening. Finally, one of the students, Mari Yamada, who was Satomi's friend, couldn't stand it and screamed, "It's impossible. She's lying." Her scream caused a new wave of panic among the children, and even the teachers could barely contain their emotions. The police arrived at the scene a few minutes after the call. Natsumi's appearance and her calmness at the sight of the police made no less a strong impression on the officers than on the students and teachers. They expected to meet a scared child who accidentally got into trouble, but instead they saw an 11-year-old girl, calm and collected, despite the blood on her clothes and hands. While one of the officers, Detective Yoshikawa, was carefully asking her questions, the other went to the very classroom where Natsumi said Satomi was lying. When he opened the door, he immediately saw the girl's body on the floor. She was lying motionless, her eyes were open, and there was a lot of blood around. At first glance, it was clear that Satomi was dead. The officer called criminologists to the scene, and soon the room was filled with specialists. Meanwhile, Detective Yoshikawa, trying to figure out what happened, asked Natsumi, "Why did you do that?" To which she calmly replied, "I just wanted to know what it's like to kill." Natsumi was arrested on the spot and handcuffed. However, her face remained as expressionless as ever. The police officers, seeing her composure and lack of emotion, only tensed up more. "This is a child, but he behaves like a hardened criminal," the police whispered among themselves. The school administration acted quickly. As soon as the police arrived and cordoned off the crime scene, all students were evacuated from the building. Many of them were in shock, crying and trying to reach their parents. The parents, in turn, quickly learned about the incident and rushed to school in a panic. The situation was escalating, and the police forces were forced to work with a crowd of worried parents, trying to keep them from storming the building. Meanwhile, the work of investigators began inside the school. A forensic team examined the scene, photographed and collected evidence. There was blood on the floor, which quickly began to solidify, creating a peculiar pattern that framed Satomi's body. There were signs of stab wounds on her neck and chest, which were inflicted with great force. The weapon of the crime was soon found, a small kitchen knife lying near the body. It was completely covered in blood, and it looked like it had been used repeatedly. This knife later became one of the key clues in the investigation. While detectives were examining the crime scene, other students and teachers began to be interviewed. The first ones, of course, were those who saw Natsumi immediately after her return to class. The students said that they saw her covered in blood, that she confessed to the murder and seemed completely calm. Some of them still couldn't believe what was happening, repeating it's just a nightmare, it couldn't really be. Detective Yoshikawa also questioned the teachers, trying to figure out if there were any harbingers of this act that could have been noticed earlier. The literature teacher, Ms. Sito, confirmed that Natsumi showed a strange interest in the topics of death and violence. Ms. Tanaka recalled that Natsumi often acted withdrawn and strange, but no one took this as a serious sign. The school psychologist, Mr. Hara, also noted that Natsumi had a tendency to isolation and periodic outbursts of aggression. However, he admitted that he did not expect such actions from her. It was a tragic mistake on our part, he said in despair. We should have seen the signs and realized that something really dangerous was going on. By the end of the day, the scene was thoroughly examined, the first witness statements were collected, and the parents of the students finally had the opportunity to take their children home. But this day was the beginning of a long and complicated investigation. The police, teachers, and parents were asking the same question: how could such a young girl commit such a crime, and what was the real reason for it? The story was just beginning to unfold, and in the coming days, the investigation was supposed to reveal many dark corners related to both Natsumi Tsuji's personality and the circumstances that led to this terrible incident. After the school was cordoned off, the full-fledged work of the investigation team began. The entire city of Sasebo was shocked by this monstrous incident, and the news about it instantly spread throughout the country. The authorities, teachers, and parents were shocked. How could an 11-year-old girl commit such a cruel crime? The knife that killed Satomi was an ordinary kitchen tool, but its blade was sharp and the handle was slippery with blood. This indicated that Natsumi acted decisively and, despite her young age, without hesitation. Apparently, she knew how to handle a knife, which raised even more questions for investigators. The interrogations of witnesses began immediately. Students and teachers were in a state of shock, and their stories were often contradictory. However, everyone agreed on one thing: Natsumi looked calm and confident when she confessed to the murder. The teachers confirmed that the girl was capable of outbursts of aggression, but no one could have imagined that she would commit murder. Natsumi Tsuji was arrested immediately after the crime and taken to the local police department. Despite her young age, the investigators understood that the case was serious and approached her interrogation with extreme caution. Natsumi was sitting in the interrogation room, and her behavior startled everyone present. She was calm and focused, as if she understood that she was the center of attention. Detective Yoshikawa began the interrogation with simple questions, trying to figure out exactly what happened. However, Natsumi's answers were short and concise. "Why did you do that?" the detective asked. Natsumi, looking him straight in the eye, replied, "I wanted to know what it's like to kill." These words sounded like an icy blow, and even an experienced detective could not hide his surprise. Natsumi didn't show any regret or fear. She calmly described how she invited Satomi into an empty room and then carried out the attack. "I didn't think about the consequences," she said. "I just wanted to do it." There was no emotion or remorse in her words, only cold calculation and a strange curiosity. Psychologists invited to the interrogation noted that Natsumi has obvious signs of psychopathy. She showed a complete lack of empathy and did not understand why her actions caused such a resonance. "I didn't think it was that serious," she repeated several times, as if trying to justify herself to herself but not to others. Investigators and psychologists began to delve into Natsumi's life to understand what could have prompted her to such a cruel act. Interviews with parents, teachers, and classmates allowed us to create a more complete picture of her psychological state. Natsumi was an intellectually developed child, but at the same time she had problems with the emotional sphere. She often felt lonely, did not understand other people's feelings, and did not know how to express her emotions correctly. Her interest in violence, which seemed like a harmless hobby, actually hid deep internal problems. The school psychologist Mr. Hara mentioned that Natsumi often complained about misunderstandings from peers and parents. She felt isolated and alienated among her classmates. Satomi seemed to be the target of her hidden aggression after she left the very comment on the blog that Natsumi took as a personal insult. This seemingly insignificant situation turned out to be the last straw that led to the tragedy. Natsumi, according to psychologists, could experience internal tension related to her inability to control her emotions and express them in socially acceptable ways. Her interest in violence and death became a kind of coping strategy mechanism, an attempt to sort out her feelings through exploring topics that seemed to her intriguing and frightening at the same time. Based on the first interrogations and observations of Natsumi's behavior, it was decided to conduct a full-fledged psychiatric examination. Psychiatrists who worked with Natsumi noted that her behavior corresponded to a number of symptoms characteristic of antisocial personality disorder. However, given her age, it was difficult to make a definitive diagnosis. She showed a lack of empathy, an interest in violence, and no remorse for her actions. The psychiatric report became an important element of the investigation, as it helped to understand Natsumi's motivation and her psychological state at the time of the crime. Further monitoring of her condition and possible treatment were recommended, but the possibility of legal liability was not excluded, given the seriousness of the crime. Investigators also began examining her computer and personal records. On the internet, Natsumi often visited sites dedicated to serial killers, violence, and dismemberment. Her search queries and browsing history confirmed that her interest in these topics was not just a hobby for her, but a part of her inner world. Details were found in her notes and drawings that suggested that she had planned the crime in advance, imagining possible scenarios and outcomes. The interrogations of students and teachers continued, and with each new interview, investigators learned more about Natsumi and her behavior before the day of the murder. Classmates recalled that, in recent months, she had become even more withdrawn and strange. She talked about death and violence with amazing ease, and she was seen more than once looking at the creepy images on her phone screen. The teacher, Miss Tanaka, said that a few days before the incident, she noticed a strange gleam in Natsumi's eyes, but did not attach any importance to it. "She's always been a little weird," Tanaka said. But who would have thought that it would go this far? Other teachers recalled that in class Natsumi could suddenly start laughing, or, conversely, become depressed when the topic concerned death or violence. These oddities were visible, but alas, no one perceived them as a real threat. The school system failed to recognize the signs of Natsumi's crisis, which could have possibly prevented the tragedy. As the investigation progressed, the picture became clearer, but questions still remained. Investigators were trying to figure out whether the murder was an act of spontaneous aggression or the result of long planning. The results of the interrogations, psychiatric examination, and analysis of evidence showed that the crime was not accidental, but also was not fully realized. Natsumi Tsuji remained a mystery, a child capable of adult violence, but with childish naivety and misunderstanding of the consequences. The investigation had to determine how to approach the solution of this difficult situation, how to bring an 11-year-old girl to justice for committing a terrible crime, and what conclusions can be drawn to prevent similar cases in the future. The trial of Natsumi Tsuji became an important moment in the Japanese legal system, as the issue of juvenile responsibility for crimes committed was discussed. Given her age and mental state, the court considered not only the facts, but also the possibility of rehabilitation. The trial was held behind closed doors due to Natsumi's age. The prosecution insisted that she was aware of her actions and had planned the murder in advance. There was evidence of her interest in violence and cruelty. The defense argued that Natsumi could not fully understand the consequences of her actions due to her age and mental state. Psychiatric experts concluded that Natsumi has signs of psychopathology, but her age does not allow us to talk about full criminal responsibility. They stressed the need for long-term therapy and follow-up. The court ordered Natsumi to be sent to a specialized juvenile facility, where she was to undergo psychiatric care and rehabilitation. This decision caused a mixed reaction. Some of the society considered it too lenient, given the brutality of the crime, while others supported the humane orientation of the sentence, focused on rehabilitation rather than punishment. This case has raised questions about how Japanese society should deal with juvenile delinquency, and which approach is most effective, punishment or rehabilitation. Natsumi's story became an occasion to review the system of work with juvenile delinquents and prompted a discussion of the need for psychological support in schools. The case of Natsumi Tsuji has revealed serious problems in the system of education, psychological care, and juvenile justice. The tragedy has shown how important it is to recognize and respond to alarming signs in children's behavior in a timely manner. The trial and subsequent public discussion highlighted the need for a comprehensive approach to the rehabilitation of young offenders, including both legal measures and psychological support. This incident was a reminder of the importance of attention to children's mental health and the need for reforms in the education and justice system.